I'm glad Paul Good is here so he can jump in if anything goes bad at my end. Okay, hello everyone. I am Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual ASN, and I'm here to welcome everyone to this event, which is planned as a conversation about non-academic careers in the field of nationalism studies. And it's part of our series on professional development, which is being developed by Paul Good and David Stroop. So I would like to thank them here publicly for working on this exciting new feature of Virtual ASN. The idea is to provide this public good to the ASN community and also to reach out beyond the community. And so I would like to thank you for joining and thank you panelists for making this possible. And I will introduce the moderator, who is our expert moderator today, Dmitry Gorenburg. He's a part of the ASN leadership, vice president of ASN. He's also a senior research scientist in the Strategy, Policy, Plans and Programs Division of CNA, where he has worked since 2000. He is an associate at the Harvard University Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and his research interests focus primarily on security issues in the former Soviet Union, Russian military reform, Russian foreign policy, ethnic politics and identity. Our managing assistant, Lucine, will be posting short bios in the chat feature. So you will see a little bit more about his CV. Here I would just say that he serves as editor of Problems of Post-Communism. And at this point, I will just turn the virtual floor over to him.
Great, thank you, Zsuzsa, and welcome everyone to this this roundtable. I'm very excited to be here. So what we're going to do today is we're going to try to have a conversation mostly, and we're going to talk about the advantages and opportunities that are available for making use of one's skills beyond academia. I think most people are familiar with how the academic job market works and how academia academic careers work, but we want to kind of highlight some of the other options. And to do that, we have three great panelists. And so I'm going to introduce all three of them at the start. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have them give very kind of brief, like two to 3 minute overviews of their career trajectory. And then we're going to have a conversation. So it's really, I'm hoping that there's lots of great questions about what people have on their minds, because I find that these kinds of conversations go best when we can address what people who are listening really are interested in. So I'm going to just introduce the panelists, and then we'll go in alphabetical order, and then we'll have that discussion. So first we have Elise Anderson, who currently works as a senior program officer for research and advocacy at the Uyghur Human Rights Project in Washington, D.C. The project is an NGO that conducts research-based advocacy in support of the rights of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. She earned dual PhD degrees in Central Eurasian Studies and ethnomusicology from Indiana University in Bloomington in August 2019. Her doctoral research, based on primary research in the Uyghur region, focuses on the relationships between Uyghur music and politics. Now, she has a varied professional background that includes experience in university teaching, in public speaking, academic editing, translation, interpreting, and grant writing. She's fluent in Uyghur and proficient in Mandarin, and is also a practicing musician and dancer. Finally, in 2019, she served as the Liu Xiaobo fellow at the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which is a US federal commission tasked with monitoring the status of human rights and the rule of law in the People's Republic of China. Our second panelist is George Gavrilis. He's a social scientist, oral historian, and consultant to a variety of international organizations and philanthropic institutions. He's currently a senior consultant to the UN Development Program for Central Asia and Afghanistan, and is also conducting oral histories for the Council on Foreign Relations, the Harriman Institute, Human Rights Campaign, and major philanthropic organizations. Previously, he served as executive director of the Holling Center for International Dialogue and was an international affairs fellow with the Council of Foreign Relations, placed at the UN Department of Political Affairs, Middle East, West Asia Division. He also taught international relations and comparative politics at University of Texas in Austin, and he has a PhD in political science from Columbia University. And then our last panelist is Frankie Huang. She's a Chinese-American freelance writer, illustrator, and strategist. She's based in the Boston area, and she's written extensively on contemporary Chinese social issues, on diaspora identity, and on the lives of women today. And she's had her work published in venues such as The Atlantic, New York Times, and The Guardian. She is a current fellow at the Encore Public Voices. Oh, she's a current Encore Public Voices Fellow with the Op-Ed Project. Sorry. So those are our three panelists, and we're just going to go in that order and have each of them provide kind of brief introductions about themselves and their career paths and how they came to be where they are, and then we'll have a discussion. So, Elise, if you'd like to start.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for the people who made this panel possible, and thank you to all of you attendees out there chiming in or tuning in. So I guess to give a brief overview of how I ended up where I am today, I think it's important to start with talking about how I ended up in academia in the first place. So I found my undergraduate years to be a very transformative experience, like many college students do. I was at a small liberal arts college in Oklahoma, which is where I am from, and found my worldview, completely transformed. And part of that was due to time I spent teaching English at Xinjiang University in Urumqi between my sophomore and junior years in college. And so when it came time to start thinking about what I did after graduating, I thought, that had been such an interesting experience. I kept reading about Uyghurs and Uyghur music. I was a music student at the time, after coming back to the United States. And so I had this crazy idea, I'm going to go to graduate school because I would like to be a professor someday. And I think I would like to learn the Uyghur language and do research on Uyghur music. Like, that sounds like a good life plan. And so that's what I did. I went to graduate school and ended up in Indiana at Indiana University, Bloomington. I took a long and winding path through graduate school, which included 2 master's degrees and then 2 PhD programs as well. It was a single dissertation, but a lot of coursework and multiple sets of exams. I spent a long time in the field doing my field work in the Uyghur region. And then in 2016, the fall, I was back in the United States trying to finish my dissertation and started going on the academic job market, because the thing that had drawn me to graduate school and all of these degrees and all of this training in the first place was that I wanted to be a professor. And to be, really frank, I found the academic job market panic-inducing and demoralizing in a lot of ways, not just to be negative here, right? I got kind of close with a couple of jobs, some telephone interviews, but then nothing was panning out. And I went on the job market, for a second year and had pretty much the same experience and was starting to panic. And then eventually, for reasons we can talk about later, I'm just bringing up some themes right now. So maybe I'm going to give you some things to ask me and ask my co-panelists about. But eventually, I just made the decision that it felt like it was time for me to walk away. And at the same time, the crisis in the Uyghur region was growing worse and worse, and our knowledge of it was growing worse and worse. And I realized that even though it was looking like I wasn't going to be able to be a professor like I thought I wanted to, there was still good that I could do in the world, and there were still ways that I could use what I had spent more than a decade of my life gaining expertise in and specializing on. And so I ended up in DC the summer after defending my dissertation to be a fellow at the China Commission on Capitol Hill. I decided, okay, DC's okay. And so I stuck around. I ended up getting this job at the NGO where I currently work, the Uyghur Human Rights Project. I've continued since then to keep one foot in academia. I've written about the things I specialize in. I've had public facing pieces like in the LA Review of Books. I just finished an academic book chapter I also spent a while working on. I also do freelance translation, interpreting, consulting, a variety of things, right? So my life doesn't look like I thought it might look, or like I imagined I absolutely wanted it to look when I made that choice to go to grad school in the first place. But I've found that, I'm still using, as I already said, I'm still using so many of the things I was working toward, and I have a life that feels good and like I'm doing good work out there in the world. So I will wrap up there. I'm really curious to hear from my co-panelists and also to hear questions from all of you shortly. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Elise. And next we'll have George Gavrilis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending and for giving me the opportunity to make a few remarks about this. So my story is a little bit like the story you just heard from Elise. I think the main difference is that I spent a little bit more time in an academic career. So I got my first teaching job at UT Austin in the Department of Government. And I stayed there for about 6 years. And I decided to leave before going up for tenure. And the reason I decided to leave is because when I was on sabbatical as an assistant professor at UT, I had some very interesting, very tangible real world experiences during that sabbatical. So one of them, for example, involved getting a fellowship with the Council on Foreign Relations. And the entire purpose of the fellowship was to take me out of my academic job, out of the academic orbit, and to put me in a policy institution and to use some of my research and writing skills in the areas and countries that I knew best, and to basically work inside an international organization. In my case, the Department of Political Affairs at the UN, to write policy memos, to do research for them, to attend meetings, to contribute to the policymaking process. And so that gave me this really interesting trial by fire glimpse into because a lot of us read things that big international organizations put out, but not many of us in academia know what it's like to sit in the belly of those beasts and to actually do the work that leads to those publications and those policies. So it was really interesting. And along the way, I got to do some travel that was not academic. For example, I spent some time doing a civilian monitoring mission in Afghanistan with ISAF. I went back to monitor the Afghan elections. And those kinds of experiences were fascinating and wonderful for me as an academic, but they were also not academic in the sense that there was no clear benefit to doing them. In fact, I remember some of my colleagues telling me after I returned from this sabbatical that I basically had wasted my time for a year. But I hadn't, because I used a lot of what I learned in my publications. And so that was interesting. But by the same token, that experience left me a little bit sad when I got back into my academic job, because as you know, academia is the kind of place where most of us, even though we talk about being collegial, 90% of the time we're working behind closed doors by ourselves, writing, researching in front of the computer. And I was a little bit thirsty for something that was more collaborative, more team-based, a little bit faster, where you have constant deadlines, rather than, let's say, 2 or 3 really big deadlines a year, as is the case often in academia. And so after I made the decision, not an easy one, to leave my job and to leave the tenure track situation, I moved back to the East Coast, and I ended up applying for an NGO job to head up the Holling Center for International Dialogue, an NGO that is based in Washington, D.C. and Istanbul, and puts together these interesting track 2 dialogues about issues that the State Department normally doesn't like to touch, but they prefer to have NGOs do it for them. And so that was an interesting experience. And what's interesting about that is the way I made the connection. I made the connection to the person that led me getting the job at the NGO through an academic conference. But it wasn't APSA, it wasn't ISA. It was one of these niche conferences on borders where you have academics with policy people, with NGO people. And I mention that because my most substantive and important network contacts actually came through those kinds of crossover conferences where it's not just academics, but there's a whole different range of phenotypes and people from different careers there. Because that's where you get to have people know you, they start thinking about you if they think you're competent, and you'll sometimes get opportunities or requests to apply for this or that. Since then, I moved to less full-time work and more full-time self-employed consulting, doing work for the UN, like Dmitry mentioned, doing various oral history projects for different institutions and other things that come together to end up being full-time engagement. And it's been interesting. So let me just leave it at that and give it back to Dmitry. Thank you.
Great, thank you, George. And our last panelist is Frankie Huang.
Hi everyone. I'm really happy to be on this panel, and I'm really intimidated by my fellow panelists. As you may have noticed, their bio was much longer than mine. But let's talk about my very, very brief flirtation with academia before I sort of moved on. So I studied English and art when I was an undergrad, but I've always wanted to be a professor. I think that was something I really wanted ever since I was young. And so after graduating from college, I moved to Beijing to kind of reconnect with my Chinese roots. And while I was there, I applied to a bunch of sociology PhD programs. And I actually did not end up getting into any of them, but I did, I did get into a master's program at the University of Chicago. And that program was sort of, it was considered like a preparation program for going into PhD programs. And I guess I was given a year to consider whether or not it's something that I wanted to continue to pursue. But my experience sort of cooled my passion for academia. I found I was sort of discouraged by my advisor that I looked up to, and one of my friends ended up being part of this like political tug of war between 2 different linguistic anthropology departments, and she didn't end up getting accepted into any programs, despite the fact that she was being fought over by top dogs at 2 different programs. But long story short, after I got my master's, I wasn't really sure what my next step was, and I still thought about going into some kind of academic work. So I ended up becoming a research assistant for this very interesting epidemiological study on elder abuse in the Chinese population in Chicago. So I ended up doing house visits and conducting extensive interviews with over 100 different elderly Chinese people. And that was a really formative experience for me. you know, I think I really cut my teeth on doing field work, in just being able to work with strangers and get them to talk to me and tell me things. But after that, I was sort of continued, I continued to be adrift. I was looking for work that, you know, is somewhat related to my previous experiences. And I somehow fell into video game localization, which is like a combination of translation and sort of testing. And that actually took me to Shanghai, where I was for the next 7 years, give or take. I worked in video game. I basically took these popular MMORPGs in China and translated and like reconfigured them for North American release in English. Not really the field that I wanted to stay in long term, but again, a really good learning experience. And that eventually took me into market research and brand consulting. And that was actually very interesting because I was back to doing ethnography, except it was commercial ethnography. And the clients are, you know, brands that wanted to understand how they're doing. They want to better understand the different demographics they're targeting for their communications. They want to test product prototypes, so things like that. And actually, I managed to use a lot of the skills that I accrued from academia, like how to do good research, as well as the interview skills that I accumulated from my elder abuse project work. So after 4 years of that, I sort of became disenchanted by the whole field because it just felt like I'm doing good research, but the knowledge is being channeled into, you know, letting brands know how to like manipulate their the consumers into buying things they don't necessarily need. I did this one project for a very prominent infant milk formula company that basically took advantage of how Chinese mothers are very insecure about the domestic products and are always looking for imported products that are safer, and basically selling very, very expensive formula to Chinese moms that can't necessarily afford it. And I felt like I'm really just contributing to you know, I'm learning interesting things about Chinese moms, but I'm using it against them. So that's how I segued into the writing that I'm doing now. And so now I do freelance journalism, and I also do illustration, and occasionally I do some brand consulting when it feels ethically acceptable to me. So I'm gonna wrap it up for now.
Wonderful, thank you, Frankie. So what we're hoping that there will be lots of questions. So please use the Q&A box for that, and I will get those and direct them to others. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I'm gonna do two things. First of all, maybe I'll just give a brief kind of similar but much briefer synopsis of my own career, so because I think, you know, there's some parallels here as well, and it might be an interesting counterpoint. I also was in grad school, like Elise, certainly planning to be a professor in political science, and went on the academic job market. That didn't work out, so I ended up getting a job at a think tank in DC, and was pretty happy there, although still sort of considering maybe my options in academia. Had a few on-campus job interviews that again didn't work out. Eventually started combining that with I got a position as executive director of what was then AAASS, now ACES, the Slavic Studies Academic Association, which was a half-time position, so I could continue to do some research as well. and I guess the one I won't sort of go through all the details. That lasted for 5 years, and then I went back to doing more consulting and also staying on at CNA. But I think the one theme that of my career, and maybe others can chime in on this as well, is that it hasn't been really that much of a plan. It's been more of a kind of a things falling into my lap, or doing one thing that then turns into some other opportunity, and kind of grabbing that. So that's been kind of my trajectory. Let me ask maybe all the panelists. I have a couple of questions. What do you miss from academia, from having left the academic world? What are the drawbacks that you see of working in the non-academic world? I mean, there's obviously a lot of positives that we've all talked about in the introductions, but are there things that you wish you were still doing? And for me, the main one has been the lack of working at a think tank. You do have much less control over what research you're doing, what questions you're answering, basically what topics you're working on, versus in an academic world where I could set my own research agenda. But I wonder if others have things to say on that. And for this part, we can, I think, if you don't mind, we can just leave the four of us can leave our cameras on. Just mute yourselves when you're not speaking. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll jump in and take a stab at answering first. What I miss, I guess, one of the things at least, is related to what you just said, Dmitry, which is maybe a little bit different. I miss sometimes like speaking for myself, or and it was definitely an adjustment to learn that I was not just representing myself, and really what the ramifications of that were potentially. So when I was at the CECC on Capitol Hill, I had a lot of very strict rules about what I could and couldn't talk about, what I could and couldn't, and talk includes tweeting, right? I was terrified to tweet. I just looked at it. I was kind of worried about even liking things and likes being misconstrued, So I took it very seriously. And I found that I personally wished that there were space for more of a public persona alongside the job that I was doing at the time. I have more freedom now, not working for the federal government and working in an NGO, but still, it's like the NGO gives us a lot of leeway, a lot of freedom in some respects, but we also have to worry about, the reputation of the organization and what we're saying. And so there are lines, that I have to understand and toe and whatever. And sometimes, I mean, I've more or less adjusted to it, but sometimes I still find myself thinking like, oh, I wish I could say this snarky thing or tweet this snarky thing. But I realize, in some ways that because, I am part of an organization doing a certain kind of work, that I want to be perceived in a certain kind of way. The stakes are a little bit different, and I don't just represent myself the way that I felt I did as someone in academia. So, thanks.
Thank you, George, Frankie. Do either of you want to chime in? Frankie, go ahead.
Sure. I think especially when I compare doing like commercial ethnography and research to academia, there's this very strong sense of serving your clients, which means the research is often quite rigorous and nuanced, but the end result pretty much always has to be packaged in a way that's simpler in these buckets that are useful for profit later on. So there's this active elimination of nuance in the final product, and it's sort of a shame, because I think in academia, when you do research, nuance is encouraged, whereas in the commercial space, if it doesn't identify some, new white space for making more money, you probably should not continue to progress in that direction.
Great, thanks. George, do you?
Yeah, I generally feel the way that Frankie and Elise do about this. It is interesting that, when you are working for clients, that you are working for them. You're not necessarily expressing your own opinions. You're bringing your expertise, but the product often doesn't have your name in a way an academic paper does. And that's something that I see a lot of academics who leave academia and go into the private sector have a lot of trouble letting go. It is not your product. It is the client's product. And you really have to have like thick skin about it. And this leads to kind of like a second point that, well, what I miss about academia, since you asked, is actually teaching, which very few people miss about academia, but I really like teaching. I really enjoyed it. But I think that is a really wonderful skill to hone when you're trying to think of a career outside of academia, because teaching, if you do it right, is a really good skill that you can use to repackage something complex and to present it in different creative, unique ways to different audiences. And so when you have, let's say, 200 students in your class from all walks of life, as I did in Texas, from all economic backgrounds, all racial and ethnic backgrounds, immigrant backgrounds, and so on, all kinds of geographies, like you really have to think about how you're going to reach them. And so that's something that that's a kind of skill that you also have to bring when you're working for clients. But the one thing that we don't have, that we're not very good at academically, is teamwork. That is often the other thing that's expected. That not only is it not your own product, but you're usually part of a bigger collective. And so you really have to let stuff go, and you have to know what battles you're going to pick and what battles you're not going to pick, because this is not like a peer review paper where every comment upsets you and everyone has not failed to recognize your brilliance. You know what I mean? Like these are people that typically know their space, and there's an important reason why they've commissioned you to do something. You really have to listen and work with other people. And so that's the one skill that I would encourage. If there's just one thing people hone, it would be to really think about how you can work with other people and make your work legible and intelligible to broader audiences. Even if you never leave academia, that's a great skill to have.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have a question from the audience, from Anna Selimovic, and she's asking, how did you break into your first jobs outside academia, and how do you do the networking aspect to get in to get from your PhD program to a position in some other field or in some related field, but not in the usual kind of career trajectory for academics. Frankie, you want to start with that one?
Sure. I think when I decided that I don't really want to continue down the academic track, I was only looking for work in the private sector. And honestly, it was not easy because like a sociology, there are no job postings for professional sociologists, right? So you really do have to, look at the skills that you do have and see what's available out there that you're interested in, but also that you can say, I can do this. I'm not someone that needs to have my hands held. I have skills to bring to the position. So for the video game job, it was actually because, and I didn't mention this before, but I also worked freelance as a translator for a very long time. And actually an old friend of mine from high school was in China at the time, and their company was growing very quickly, and they were desperate for people that had the right skill set and are willing to do this job. And I said, I've never thought about working in video game. And he said, I mean, it's fine. You're a translator and you have organizational skills, and you can communicate with people, so we can make it work. So a lot of times it does come down to like making a list of things that you can do, and it's not just classes you've taken, but like you break it down to like different tasks that you have performed, and note the ones that you enjoy or feel like you're good at, and that's going to help you filter for positions that you are potentially competitive in, and or might be happy doing. Yeah.
Great. Do Elise, George, or either of you like to chime in?
Sure. I can chime in and say that, I mean, like Frankie, I was doing a lot of freelance work anyway. I mean, it was still the end of graduate school and I was trying to finish up the dissertation, but many of us here know what grad school stipends are like. So I'd already been doing freelance interpreting and translation work and so forth. And then, when I finally really articulated to myself, okay, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to pursue something other than academia. I remembered in January 2019, oh yeah, Congressional Executive Commission on China. They have those summer fellowships. And I was actually pretty late putting my application together, but I put an application together, and eventually, got the position. And what this ended up meaning was that I spent 4 months making $12 an hour with no benefits in one of the most expensive areas of the country, right? So bringing that up to say, I broke into what I'm doing now by willingly, knowingly walking into a situation where I was going to be struggling materially. And I don't want to glamorize it at all, because it was incredibly difficult. On the flip side, CECC treated me well in terms of, the staff and the directors treating me like an intellectual equal and trusting me with research work and writing work that I'm so glad to have done. And I still draw really directly from many of the things I did there. But, I could go off on a whole tangent about the conditions of exploitation in which many of us labor and that come along with many jobs and the way we're compensated now. But without harping on it, being willing to kind of suffer for a period was one thing that I did. So, George.
Yeah, I think my main point is one that I made earlier, but I think it's worth reiterating that when you're in academia, you tend to go to the usual conferences that are the big ones in your field. If you're political science, it's APSA, it's ISA. You will not make networks there outside of academia, at least not in a really strong way. So you need to think about conferences within your field, whether it's something on Russia, whether it's something on borders, whether it's something on new approaches to statistics that are going to be not only interdisciplinary, but are going to have people coming at them from outside of academia in different fields. So if you can identify conferences to go there, and even if you can't find the support, it may be worth your while once a year to go to something like this, where you meet people that are not in academia, but are interested in the kinds of things that you care about. And it is those weak ties, to use a sociology term, that are often where you get the most interesting, your parents are not going to give you a job lead. Your best friend is not, and your immediate PhD cohort is not. It is people that you know less, but that you've met somewhere and you've impressed them and they remember you. Those are the people that are going to be your best resources, better than LinkedIn, better than your colleagues in the PhD program. And so I would encourage people to think about those kinds of events or conferences that they can attend where there's going to be a really interesting cross-section of people. And it's an investment and it's a slow one. But if you're not graduating, like right now, and you have a few more years, it's time to start thinking about that.
Great, thanks. We have another question that actually relates to what would have been my answer to the previous question, so I'll kind of combine a little bit. And the question is, for those of you who were unsuccessful on the academic job market, did you receive any sort of support from your department to find a job, or were you on your own? And for me, from the answer, and this is kind of answers, how I got there, there wasn't any support from the department, but what there was support from the general career services office at the university, which is, its own thing, and not every university has a strong placement office for graduate students outside of the academic placement aspect. But I was at Harvard, and Harvard did, at least 20 years ago. I don't know. I hope it still does. And so they were really instrumental in putting me in touch with both sort of helping me get a lay of the land of what the main think tanks in DC were, and then putting me in touch with alumni who had agreed to be part of the network, the sort of the Harvard networks, and refer recent students to those people. And then I talked to some of those people, and one of those people ended up saying, "Oh, we're actually hiring. Why don't you apply for a job here?" And I was at CNA, and that's how I ended up there. So that was really critical for me. But the department didn't do much of anything. And I wonder if others might have similar or different experiences. Frankie, you wanna start?
So I was actually kind of optimistic initially about University of Chicago's sort of career services, because they boasted that they have like a 90-something% placement rate for the people that they helped. But of course, I took a stats class. I know you can manipulate numbers, and as it turns out, they refuse to help you if they don't think you're that good. So they will, help place people if they feel like, you're very impressive, and that person will be hired. But they do turn people away, and so I didn't actually end up getting much help from the department, because clearly I did not stand out in a remarkable way.
I got no institutional support for deciding to walk away from the academic job market and trying to seek, a professorship. So I had co-chairs because I was in 2 different programs, right? And one of my co-chairs said to me, "I think you would be great in academia, and I'd love to see you be a professor, but I get it. I understand. I support you." It was good to have that. My other co-chair actively discouraged me from leaving academia and seeking a non-tenure track job, and tried to tell me too that I hadn't been at it long enough to understand, the academic job market. And I didn't say anything back, but I was thinking to myself at the moment, well, you haven't applied for a job in like 25 years. So I think maybe you're the one who doesn't understand that, right? Again, not to harp too much on the negative things. It worked out, right? I was able to find something on my own and forge my own path. But in the process of experiencing not having any institutional support, I wished there had been some institutional support. I had that bit of encouragement from one of my co-chairs, but he himself is a tenured professor, right, and couldn't offer much practical advice necessarily.
It's an interesting thing that everyone's talking about, because I experienced a little bit of that myself, and obviously your dissertation advisors are going to be really good at writing academic letters for the job market, but they won't necessarily know what to do to write the right letter for you for a non-academic job, because they themselves aren't sure what goes into that kind of a job. So it's tough. There's a second issue that I noticed when I was graduating, and this was a number of years ago, was if you were graduating with a PhD, you were entitled to go to the career and placement services, but their role, besides a very thin binder of quasi-academic jobs was to simply hold your letter and to send it out to the jobs once you told them what jobs you were applying to. There was a separate career and placement services for the policy school, but we were not allowed, PhDs were not allowed to go to the career and placement services office for the master students. And that's where the real binders were, with all the policy jobs and all the connections and the internships, et cetera, et cetera. So if that is the situation in your university, you can do one of two things. And I'm sure that this is not sanctioned. One is to have your advisor, and hopefully she or he supports your decision to look both at the academic job market and the non-academic job market, that they might pick up the phone and call the career and placement office that is just for the master's program and see if they will make an exception and let you in. Another thing to do is to just ask somebody who is in the master's program to go and to spend an hour pulling jobs for you. These things often exist in private and in secret, like access and no access. And so it's to your advantage, particularly if you're at a larger academic institution or a university, to ask what the specific career and placement services are for people in master's programs and see if you have a good way to access some of that. So that's one good place to learn about these opportunities as well. But as you can see, there's no formal channel because it's not what we're good at in academia. And the other thing that burns me up about academia is that we're not responsive to the market. More or less, graduate admissions programs admit the same number of students a year, plus or minus a little bit, and they're not like, gosh, it was a really terrible year, so we should kind of project what it's going to be like in the next 3, 4, 5, 7 years. We tend to not do this. And so you would think that alongside that, and to buffer the lack of jobs, to make up for it, that there would also be some sort of a parallel service for people that also want to explore non-academic jobs. But in most places, that is still not the case. And I think that this actually needs to be reformed from the top down by senior faculty and provosts demanding that either PhD programs tailor their numbers to the predicted job market, or at the very least that they put a little bit of money in career opportunity sources and services for students outside of academia.
Great, thanks. I'm going to try to kind of combine two questions here. And the gist of them is how for people who are either current students in PhD programs or recent graduates, how does one find out what opportunities are available, what kind of career tracks are available, and what can they be and what can the students be doing to prepare for the job market in non-academic fields as they're going through their PhD programs, if they've kind of decided along, maybe not before that endpoint that the non-academic track is where they want to go. What can they do to get ready for that? I don't know, maybe George, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Put me on the spot. Let me see if I can answer this. So I'll link it to some of the things that I've said before. One is when you go to these crossover niche conferences, make a point of taking half an hour over coffee to sit with somebody that is outside of academia and to ask them how they did it, but to also ask them what kinds of opportunities there are in that field. Because just by engaging that kind of a conversation, if the person likes you, they will remember you. So don't just go to these conferences, but try to sit down with a couple of people who are doing interesting things outside of academia and ask them. The second thing I would advise people to do, and this is probably more obvious given that this is ASN, is to actually spend a little bit of time at the area studies institutes, because good area studies institutes have thought about the different tracks that have to be made available to people graduating with, let's say, an MA in Russian studies. And if you happen to be a PhD, it doesn't hurt to go and to spend some time with some of the faculty there, some of the students there, and to ask them, what is the program doing for them, and how do they envision the various tracks that are available to people that may have good statistical skills, may speak one or two languages. You'd be surprised. To give you an example, Alex Cooley at the Harriman Institute at Columbia is spending a lot of time thinking about this for the master's program, right? But then the PhD program, which is just a couple floors below him, isn't thinking about this stuff. But PhD students from there don't think of just going up the stairs or taking the elevator to talk to somebody in the Harriman Institute about what the world is like outside of there. So just think of some of the arenas and places that are a little bit better at sending students out in the world to do more than just teach at a university. And what do those careers look like? That's very helpful, but you are largely on your own. I'm not going to lie to you. Like, you have to make the effort yourself, because there's no regular career and placement service that is dually designed to give PhDs maximal opportunities outside of academia.
Thanks. Frankie, go ahead.
Sort of continuing what George just said about how you're on your own, so you need to be very proactive. I think one of the really helpful things that you can do while you're still doing your PhD program is to start getting to know industries that you might be interested in entering by, looking at industry-specific publications and reading up on things that are happening, different companies and institutions that are doing interesting work that you might want to be part of. Just to give you an example, I was in marketing for 4 years, and for marketing, there's Ad Age and there's Campaign, and these are two very, very good industry rags that talk, like, it's not just about like new companies that are doing things or companies doing new things. It's also these like very thoughtful write-ups about developments in ways of doing things, techniques, things that are going wrong. Like I genuinely enjoy reading, I still read these publications, and you can reach out to the companies that are interesting to you or the writers that wrote something that interests you and just have a dialogue, and people who are already in there can tell you about their observations, things they're not necessarily publishing. So, you can get a really great idea, like fairly good idea of what you want and what you want to know more about just by being proactive.
Go ahead, Elise.
Okay, great, thanks. And to echo things that both George and Frankie have said, so one, peers, right, colleagues are going to be wonderful resources, whether it's, people from your own institution or people you're meeting at conferences and so forth. And then again, I would also reiterate that, looking into industries you're interested in is helpful, and seeing what people are talking about, what people are doing, the kinds of jobs that exist. If you are thinking about something like, I wouldn't mind working in government, I wouldn't mind working in public service, start following, if you can, sign up for updates, alerts, announcements about jobs and positions from the likes of USA Jobs. So in the United States, USA Jobs is kind of a portal for federal employment. It's a horrible website, which tracks in general with the way most government websites are, at least in this country. But you can. I have this feeling, right, that many of us who are here, ASN, virtual ASN, have some kind of area component of what it is that we're most interested in and what it is that we do. So for me, I would go to USA Jobs and just type in China, right, and see what would come up. And to my surprise, on some occasions, there would be jobs not even just in DC, but in other parts of the United States as well, that would pop up, with advertisements for jobs looking for people who knew certain things about China, right? I think the thing is that we do have to be proactive, and there's not going to be a lot of support anywhere. This is kind of tailored and a thing we need to do for ourselves in many ways, but there's so much more out there that makes the things in our world run, right? There are so many more types of work out there than academia that are still valuable. And it feels really hard to see that because we have put ourselves in a situation where our whole job is to be really laser focused on something very specific and on building this very niche expertise in many cases. And if, you know, we've got this tunnel vision we've narrowed in on, but if we can kind of zoom back out, right, it's starting to see the forest that we work in rather than the tree we've specialized in understanding as an expert on something.
Great, thanks. We have two questions that are kind of similar, but flip it in the focus to it in a different direction. These are from Natalie Cook and Paul Good. So do you have any suggestions for those who are faculty about how to teach or configure classes to better serve students who don't want academic careers? And what can grad programs, similarly, what can grad programs do to better sensitize students to these alternative career tracks? So similar, but the focus now, you know, more on what the faculty can do to help, and the programs and the universities can do. I don't know if somebody want to take the lead on that. George, go ahead.
Yeah, why not? So, well, I mean, inevitably students will come to you and ask you what they should be looking for and where they should be applying, but it's not our jobs to tell them, oh, this organization is hiring, you should apply there. But I think that we have a responsibility as teachers, as educators, to teach our students how to use different skills. And we tend to default in the same kind of assignment over and over again. Not everybody, not exclusively, but you know, most of what we ask the students to do is to read and then to write about it, either in class or in paper form. Sometimes the papers are long, sometimes they're short, but the writing remains academic. And I think that programs that are at the PhD level or that are not, let's say, policy-driven master's programs need to have a little bit more of a master's program component into the teaching, which is to, in every class, particularly every class that's about a country or a region, or let's say a security issue, something very tangible and policy-oriented, for the professor and the person teaching that class to give assignments, number one, that teach students how to write, let's say, policy briefs, or in some cases, an exercise such as you've just received an email from your boss and she wants you to write 2 paragraphs of, or like talking points for a speech that she's going to give on the death penalty in Iran because somebody at the UN is really upset about it. Right? We need to teach students how to write talking points, how to write a 1-pager. People outside of academia are not forgiving when you breach a length limit. Like, we do it all the time in academia. We're supposed to write 10 pages, we write 15. That does not fly in the world outside of academia. Like, you, no matter how good it is, people will get incensed and upset that you have ignored the format or that you haven't used the right language. And I think that in our classes, we really need to teach students how to respond in a tailored way to different kinds of assignments that aren't just analyzing the readings and responding in an essay format or a research paper format. So I think that that's what should be built into every single class in political science, for example, in sociology at the PhD level, that there has to be some sort of assignment that is tailored to the private sector, to the NGO sector, or to like an international organization. And that's not just for the PhD. That's not just for people to learn how to operate outside of the PhD world. I think that that is fundamentally good for everyone's writing skills, because we often don't tailor what we write to our audiences. We're tailoring it to ourselves and what we want to tell people. And I think we have to be really good at writing a really solid talking point that is this long, as well as a 1-pager, as well as a 50-page research paper. You know, there are some days when I have to do all 3 of those at the same time, and you have to know how to transition. And I did not learn that in any of my classes.
Wonderful, thanks, George. Elise, go ahead.
Yeah, it reminds me of the first time I did a live television spot. So I give regular television commentary now, and sometimes I've been on radio. And I was live on the BBC World, and I was giving a nuanced academic style answer, and the interviewer cut me off in the middle of it and went on to the next question. So overall, the spot was fine. I walked away feeling good about it. You know, I could laugh about it. It wasn't like the first response I was giving, but I was like, oh yeah, you've got to get to the point. This is not the place to spin out this really complex, nuanced, gorgeous answer for someone. That was one thing. To George's excellent comments, I would add too, an exercise like how to write an op-ed, how to communicate, you know, something you're an expert on, right, or have a nuanced analysis of in 750 words for a general readership of a newspaper. And even different newspapers, right, take different approaches to op-eds, or take slightly, you know, are slightly different in focus. So an op-ed in the Washington Post would look somewhat different from an op-ed in the New York Times even, right? And it's not necessarily going to be a professor's job to make sure that a student walks away knowing all of those fine differences, but it's this bigger point about how to communicate with different people who do different kinds of work that are still ultimately related in some ways, because again, academia is not the only thing out there. It's not the only place to do good work. It's not even the only place to do good intellectual work.
Frankie, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly, you know, what George and Elise said are spot on, I think. Just showing people how to communicate differently for different audiences is just really, really important. And I've done, you know, I think the extremes of different kinds. I've written, you know, 200 pages of bullet points for corporate clients, and I've written for newspapers, and I've done some academic writing, and they are very, very different. And, you know, now I'm working with different publications and different editors, just as Elise said. Every time you write for a different audience, you have to like, that is the lens you filter your narrative through. And being a good storyteller, I think, is important for people who choose to stay in academia or leave it, because you know, I still have to read on occasion an academic paper, and I just feel like, you know, it can only be a good thing for academic writing to be made more accessible for the general public, because, you know, there's a lot of blanks in people's knowledge that they could be filling with good research that they find too difficult to read.
George, you want to add?
I just want to jump in because as Frankie and Elise were talking, I remembered something I did in one of my classes. It was a seminar, a research seminar, and the endpoint was to write this 25-page paper based on deep research. And I tried to give smaller exercise that built up to it, but it was still all very academic. It was about academic research and writing and proving and disproving theories. But one of the most useful things that we did is because the students weren't used to what academic writing is like. And so I decided to take abstracts from JSTOR. So I told them, go to JSTOR and find the most convoluted abstract you can find. And I want you to turn those abstracts, those one-paragraph abstracts, into something that anyone off the street can understand what they're about, or even talking points. And even something as seemingly simple as that can be like eye-opening for students. And so we tend to overcomplicate some of our assignments. I've seen assignments that are meant to help students do more policy relevant writing, and the instructions for writing a one-pager are 3 pages long. That's not cool, right? Like that just confuses people. Simple is sometimes the best. If I was still teaching, I would embed that abstract rewriting assignment into every single one of my courses. And in fact, the funniest one was when a student found an abstract about an article that was deconstructing Free Willy. the movie about the orca that was in Iceland, and it was incomprehensible. And the student rewrote the abstract. And what was really radical about the revision of the abstract, they went from being like deconstructionist sociology to being something that was exceptionally and shockingly relevant for conservation, the environment, ethics on, about animal rights. It had like all of these real world understandable implications. And how cool that a student was able to do that in just a few short minutes, to take something really dense that an academic in love with their own writing had written, and to turn it into something that might matter to National Geographic. It might make sense to a company that's doing corporate and social responsibility in terms of like clean oceans, that kind of stuff. There's so many opportunities.
Thanks. I have a question that maybe first for Elise, and maybe others can chime in also. Selnaz Bashkan asks, I would like to know what do you like about working for NGOs, and what satisfies you about the job?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, one of the things that jumps immediately to mind is that, and this picks up on something George said, I think back at the very beginning of this session, that so much of what we do is team-based, right? So we are putting out press releases as a team. We're a very small NGO, 8 people, but it's kind of like we have small groups that work as teams within that larger team. And so, sometimes I might be working on putting out a press release with some of my colleagues, or working on a major research report that we put out, because we do primary source research and documentation at my NGO as well. And I actually, coming from the humanities and academia, where I was supposed to be this one-woman wonder who could, read and write and theorize and edit and put out very polished, excellent prose kind of all by myself, right? After doing great original primary research, it's felt kind of wonderful and like a relief to be working on various parts of the research and writing process directly with my colleagues. And I think we produce work at a pretty quick pace, much more quickly than I did on my own in academia, but that still meets, high standards of research and writing, precisely because we're working together. And then, I guess another element of what I like working at an NGO is just that I think we see some tangible results of what we do in a much quicker way than I ever did in academia. It took years for my first peer-reviewed academic paper to get any citations, right? Just years, because of the way publishing works. But the news coverage we get on things that we write, the spots on TV or radio or whatever, it's just one measure among several of the impact that we're having, the reach, the fact that people are actually, we can really see that people are reading, using, and going on to make policy based on some of the things that we're doing. That feels really rewarding.
Thanks. I don't know, to Frankie, George, do you want to add anything to that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Elise has put her finger on something really important, that it has effects. It's quick. It's almost immediate, the work. What I also liked about it was that elements of NGO work could be very academic, because people were asking really big questions about, why is authoritarianism in this country really difficult to crack? Why are we unable to improve the quality of education in this sector? Those are big questions. But what's cool is that you not only work on it with good research and you do short, tangible write-ups that busy people can read and understand, but the nice thing is that you're part of a team, and then that team has to disseminate this to the world. You don't just publish an academic journal, like you're saying, Elise, and wait a couple of years for the citations to start getting back. So one of the things that I love most was the consultations that we would do with the things that we would write. in the NGO. We would meet with the Prime Minister's office. We would meet with parliamentarians. We would go to, when we were in the US, we would go up to the Hill or to the State Department and have these really interesting debates with people about our findings. And there's something really great, even when the people are jerks, because that did happen a lot that you were talking to, of being able to actually speak with a policymaker or somebody in a bureaucratic organization in charge of a particular program about what they might do better or differently. And even if they disagreed and it didn't go anywhere, you still got this kind of lift from doing it and this excitement that you don't always get in academia, where you write your paper, a few months later, you go to a conference where you publish it, you get a few comments, then you submit it to a journal a few months later, and then 6 months later, you hear back from, you know what I mean? It's like painfully slow paced, and the NGO clip is fast, fast, fast.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to kind of combine two questions again here. There's one that asks, it seems that most of you had plans for an academic career, i.e. you went on the academic market. Did any of your peers or other students in your cohort or department opt to go straight to the non-academic track? And what was, do you anything you can say about that experience? And somewhat related, now that you're in a non-academic career, would you like to have a full-time academic job position in the future, or are you kind of, have you closed off that direction and are kind of happy continuing in the direction where you are right now? I don't know, Frankie, you want to start this week?
Sure. So I was in a master's program, and I think maybe half of my cohort was seriously considering continuing on applying to PhD programs, while the other half, I think, never really planned to, and they came to get a master's to get a boost for their CV. And yeah, one of my friends that I think I mentioned her earlier, she ran into a lot of obstacles trying to get into a PhD program. And there were others that were saying there were so few funded PhD programs available, and they seriously had to consider whether or not they wanted to go into a lot of debt. And a few of them ultimately decided that they weren't willing to take out loans just to do a PhD program. So this was in 2011. So the economy was not in great shape. There was very little fund. I mean, there was less funding than before. And the other question about whether I would ever want to go into academia, probably not. I feel like you do need to be in that environment and be part of that network and know people. And the older I get, the less likely it feels that it would work if I try to work in academia in the future.
I'll jump in next. I did have a number of colleagues in both of my programs who had a sense from early on that they wanted to go onto non-academic tracks. So in ethnomusicology, and at Indiana, ethnomusicology is in its own department with folklore. It's pretty distinct. That happens nowhere else in the world. Folklore is an academic discipline that largely went public sector. It's not really much of an academic discipline left anymore for a lot of complicated reasons. But that meant that, at least among my peers, it didn't always translate into the way we were taught, right? and the way the curriculum was structured. But I did have a lot of peers who came in knowing, I want to go do public sector work. I want to work at a public arts agency. I want to work in a museum. That was a track a lot of people went on. And then in the Central Eurasian Studies side, there was a mix of people who definitely wanted to go into academia, but others who were considering government careers from the very start, or NGO stuff. And then as for this question of whether I would want to be a professor, I don't think so. I've made my peace with it. There are things that seem tempting. Sometimes I think, oh, the flexibility, that sounds great. And there are some things I miss. Academia, as a very long-term graduate student, helped me to do a lot of things I would never have been able to do otherwise. And I'm really grateful for it, but I don't want to go back.
George, you want to add anything?
Yeah, in my cohort, there were a couple people that went into non-academic jobs. I remember one of them went to Eurasia Group, another went and worked for the State Department, and luckily the U.S. government, at least when it comes to U.S. citizens, the U.S. government still remains pretty open to hiring PhDs, so long as the PhD is not kind of like lost in the weeds of academia and has something bigger and constructive to say about the broader world. So so I saw a little bit of that, and I remember other people were also interested in the prospect, and so they were looking at other organizations, like Human Rights Watch, or instead of going down an academic path, what if I become, like a permanent fellow at a place like CSIS or CFR? That I remember that was some of people's thinking. I mean, there are some people that have made careers out of just like permanent fellowships at big think tanks, but those jobs are few and hard to come by.
Thanks, George. We've got a little over 10 minutes left, so we're gonna maybe start wrapping up and give all of you a chance to make some final comments, and maybe just as you're sort of thinking what say one thing that this kind of structured a little bit. This comes from David Stroop. How did you, in going into this non-academic career track, how did you figure out how to apply your training from academia, from grad school, to what you were doing in your work? And what advice would you give to others looking outside of what they might consider their academic area? So that, if you want to address that or any other sort of final comments that you might have, we have, as we begin to wrap up, and maybe we'll just go back to the original order. And Elise, if you'd like to start.
Darn, I was kind of hoping for someone else to chime in first. So I'm work at a human rights NGO now, and I've already talked about how we conduct research-based advocacy, but I don't know if I would exactly qualify it as a stretch. There has been a learning curve for me in remembering, oh yes, policy recommendations are one of the big goals of this thing we want to get out, making recommendations to different actors. So policy recommendations aren't even one size fits all, and also there are these things called international human rights standards. There are treaties and certain organizations that have standards and write all sorts of in some cases complicated things to read. Like, have you ever tried reading a UN document? It can be a kind of overwhelming sometimes, but there are standards, there are norms, there are ways that people who work in human rights speak to one another and speak about the work that they do. And I definitely was not trained specifically for that in academia. So there has been a learning curve. There has been a learning curve for me in just learning how to write policy recommendations, period. But there are certainly transferable skills I learned from my time in academia. I do not come from a family with people who have PhDs. I didn't know what I was doing. I had no grand plan. I was kind of stumbling naively along for much of my career and much of my life. I learned lingo. I learned how to write in academic ways. I learned how to do research. I also, in working as a graduate assistant, I worked in editing at a journal. I worked in a grant writing center, helping people to, articulate in very different ways the research they were proposing to do. And so all of those skills have very much served me. And on one level, it's just in reminding me, oh yes, I know how to learn things. But then in another way, the skills that I learned in academia and graduate school helped me to bring perspectives that are useful to my NGO as well. Like, for example, I've been helping to develop a style guide for the publications that we put out, which is something that comes directly from the time I spent working as an editorial assistant, and is, I think, doing some good within the organization, and might even have portions of it that turn into some talking points that we use in our advocacy, right? So I would say to just everyone who's out there, don't be discouraged by feeling like you didn't learn exactly all the things you need to know in this job you're going into that's outside of academia, because when do we ever know all of everything we need to know?
I like that question that you channeled on behalf of David Dmitry about whether doing some of these jobs felt like a stretch in terms of my previous training. And here's what's interesting about that. And I think it goes back to something I said earlier about how when you leave academia and you're working either as a consultant or for an NGO, you are not your own human being anymore. You are part of a team. You represent an organization. They have hired you because they don't think it's going to be a stretch for you. Like, they've looked at your capacities, they've looked at your skills. They know you can do the technical aspects of the job that they've brought you on board to do. The place where people fail when they come in from academia is what I said earlier, which is that the stretch for them is not knowing how to write for a policy audience, it's knowing how to work on a team where it's not their own product. And that, I think, is the most difficult skill to learn, that you've gone from academia, which is about you with the inputs from your advisors and people that also know the area, to being part of a team at an NGO or on a consultancy. And that's where people tend to flop, because they forget that. And the other thing that they don't realize is that they're not on their own. When you're in a consultancy or an NGO, you are expected, if something is unknown or difficult, to ask your colleagues for help. And we're typically not told to do that in academia, right? Our paper is our own to write, and we're supposed to muddle through and figure it out and then just get some feedback. And that's what the stretch is. The stretch is, are you truly and utterly capable of working as part of a team and knowing that your name is not going to be under a title of a product?
Great. Frankie?
Yeah, I want to reiterate what George just said about when organizations ask you to do something, they think you can do it. I put down in my notes to tell people to always say yes when opportunities are offered to them, because that's what I forced myself to do. Because I think every job that I've gone into has been a stretch in some sense. And I think it should be normalized. It's good to get out of our comfort zone, and beyond that phrase being a cliche, I think it's also very helpful, especially when you want to transition beyond academia and going to the private sector, for example. I think it's really important to keep in mind that while your expertise may not apply to whatever new job that you're doing, there's a certain structure to a lot of kinds of work that doesn't change even if the content does. And, you have your critical thinking skills, your analytical thinking, and what you should do is apply that to understanding the job that you're doing and understand what it takes to, do a good job and give your team and your client what they want and what they need.
Great. Well, thank you very much to all the panelists. I think this was a great session, and I certainly learned a lot about all the different ways that we can be non-academics but still remain engaged in at least to some extent, 1 foot in the door in or near academia. I hope it was useful for everyone. Shuja, I don't know if do you have some final words for the group?
Yes, I would like to. I came back just very briefly to thank everyone, Elise, Frankie, George, Dima, and all of our participants who have sent in questions and helped to turn this into a truly fascinating conversation. I have certainly learned a lot, and will be recommending the video to others. And I have been making notes about your specific recommendations, including George's recommendation for the assignment for an understandable abstract in my teaching. I will definitely include that. So here's the place for me to remind everyone also that the panel, the recording will be posted on vASN on the website. So you can just Google vASN and you will find it there, as well as other recordings of previous webinars. And this is also the place for me to say that we are hoping that if you're not yet an ESN member, that you will consider this, to consider membership so you can become part of this international community, which really truly has the mission of being an inclusive community, including younger people, including people from across various regions, various institutions and domains in which we are working on issues of nationalism and ethnicity. So we are bridging and trying to be as inclusive as possible, and please consider joining. Last point, the ESN's annual World Convention is coming up. It will be from May 5th to 8th. And this year it will be online. We are hoping that we can go back to our annual World Convention site next year, to the Harriman Institute of Columbia University, but this year we are really doing our best. There's a lot of work going into trying to use the online space in a way that continues the ASN community tradition. So with that, I will close, and I hope to see you next time at the next virtual ASN event. Thank you.